Welcome to War Machines Chronicles. Today, we journey back 15,000 years to the banks of the Nile River, to a time when humanity was on the cusp of a new era. Here, in a place now known as Jebel Sahaba, lies the oldest evidence of organized human warfare ever discovered. This isn't a story of glorious empires or grand armies, but a grim tale of survival, conflict, and the dark origins of human violence, long before the first cities were ever built. In the 1960s, archaeologists working on the border of modern-day Sudan and Egypt made a startling discovery. They unearthed a prehistoric cemetery containing the remains of 61 individuals, men, women, and even children. At first glance, it seemed like a typical burial site for a hunter-gatherer community from the late Paleolithic period. But as they examined the skeletons more closely, a horrifying picture began to emerge. This was no peaceful resting place. This was a mass grave, a silent testament to a prolonged and brutal conflict. What the scientists found was chilling. Almost half of the individuals buried at Jebel Sahaba had died violent deaths. Their bones were riddled with injuries. Dozens of sharp flint arrowheads and spear points were found embedded directly in their skeletons, lodged in chests, backs, and pelvises. These weren't hunting accidents. The placement and number of projectiles clearly indicated they were deliberately aimed to kill other humans. One man was found with 19 separate projectile points still stuck in his body. Another skeleton, that of a woman, had a flint shard lodged in her forearm, a classic defensive wound suggesting she tried to shield herself from an attack. The weapons used were a deadly combination of ranged and close-quarters armaments. The primary weapons were bows and arrows, along with light spears or javelins. These allowed attackers to strike from a distance, raining down lethal projectiles on their targets. The sheer number of these points found in the bodies tells us these were not isolated skirmishes, but intense volleys of fire. But the violence didn't end there. Examination of the bones also revealed evidence of close combat injuries, fractured skulls from heavy blows with clubs or rocks, and cut marks on bones consistent with daggers or flint knives, show that the fighting was personal, brutal, and face-to-face. These hunter-gatherers had weaponized their hunting tools, turning them into specialized instruments for killing their own kind. Perhaps the most shocking revelation from Jebel Sahaba was the nature of the conflict. This was not a single isolated massacre. By studying the wounds, forensic anthropologists discovered something profound. Many skeletons showed signs of both healed and unhealed injuries. This means individuals had survived previous attacks, only to be killed in a later one. The evidence points to a continuous, recurring cycle of violence that may have spanned months, years, or even generations. It was a state of endemic warfare, a series of brutal raids and counter-raids between rival groups. This wasn't a one-time battle. It was a long, grinding war of attrition. Who were the victims? The cemetery tells us that no one was spared. The presence of men, women, and children among the dead suggests that entire communities were being targeted. This wasn't ritualized combat between designated warriors. These were raids on camps, where the goal was likely the complete annihilation of the rival group. The attackers were not just fighting other men, they were exterminating families. This is a pattern more akin to tribal warfare or ethnic cleansing than a structured battle driven by a desperate struggle for survival. So, why did this happen? Why would these ancient hunter-gatherer bands, who we often imagine living in harmony with nature, engage in such relentless violence? The answer likely lies in the dramatic climate change of the era. Around 13,000 BC, the world was emerging from the last ice age. This period, known as the Late Glacial Maximum, was a time of extreme environmental instability. In North Africa, this meant severe droughts and dramatic fluctuations in the flow of the Nile River. For the people living along the Nile, the river was their lifeline. It provided fish, attracted game, and nourished edible plants. But as the climate became harsher and more unpredictable, these vital resources would have become scarce and concentrated in smaller, more desirable areas. Different groups would have been forced into closer proximity, competing for the same dwindling food and water supplies. What was once a vast territory might have shrunk to a few precious miles of riverbank. In this high-stakes environment, cooperation could easily give way to conflict. The people of Jebel Sahaba were likely fighting a desperate war for the resources they needed to survive. It was a zero-sum game, where one group's survival meant another's demise. Jebel Sahaba completely shatters the romantic notion of the peaceful savage. It forces us to reconsider the origins of warfare. For a long time, historians believed that organized war was a product of civilization, that it began with agriculture, the ownership of land, the rise of cities, and the formation of states. The logic was that hunter-gatherers had little to fight over, being nomadic and without fixed property. Jebel Sahaba proves this theory wrong. It provides undeniable proof that large-scale, organized violence existed thousands of years before the first farms were planted or the first walls were built. The conflict here was not for glory, ideology, or territory in the modern sense. It was a raw, primal struggle for existence, fueled by climate change and resource scarcity. The people of Jebel Sahaba formed distinct groups, likely with their own cultural identities, and saw each other as rivals, as enemies. They fought and died for control of the fishing spots and hunting grounds that meant the difference between life and starvation. Modern analysis reinforces this view. Researchers have suggested that the conflict was between distinct cultural populations, perhaps an established local group, and a new group of migrants being pushed into their territory by the changing environment. This clash of cultures, combined with the desperate competition for food, created a perfect storm for sustained, brutal violence. In conclusion, the silent skeletons of Jebel Sahaba tell one of the most important stories in human history. They reveal that the capacity for organized, group-on-group violence is deeply rooted in our past, predating civilization itself. It is a sobering reminder that when resources become scarce and survival is on the line, humanity has a long and dark history of turning on itself. The so-called War of Jebel Sahaba was not a war in the way we think of it today, with generals and battle plans. It was a gritty, terrifying, and prolonged series of ambushes and massacres, a brutal chapter in the human story that laid the groundwork for millennia of conflict to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey into our deep past here at War Machines Chronicles. If you found this exploration of ancient conflict fascinating, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories from the dawn of warfare. We'll see you next time.